We don't see those delegations which always come to the meetings called by Western states on Ukraine. They're not here in the chamber, but that's what we expected anyway. Today, what we suggest is that we focus not on empty rhetoric and accusations, but rather on a constructive discussion of real progress as regards the peaceful settlement of the Ukrainian crisis, including a focus on objective obstacles which continue to stand in the way of lasting peace. The logic behind what's happening with the Ukrainian settlement process is simple. Sensible forces in Ukraine, Russia, the new US administration, and the countries of the global south first are taking serious steps to ensure that military hostilities in Ukraine end and never resume. But a simple ceasefire is not enough to achieve this. We already once stood at this very crossroads in the context of the Minsk agreements, which were systematically violated by the West in Ukraine. To achieve sustainable and lasting settlement of the Ukrainian crisis, we need to address its root causes. This is why Russia proposed resuming direct Russo-Ukrainian talks in Istanbul, which were suspended by Kyiv in April of 2022 at the behest of Boris Johnson and other Western leaders. What we're proposing is a second round of talks in Istanbul this coming Monday on the 2nd of June, where we can exchange memoranda about both parties' approaches to the negotiations process. Yet there's a whole host of forces who aren't interested in this scenario, and this for various reasons. The overstayer Ukrainian president doesn't want to stop military hostilities because he fears losing his grip on power. If this happens, he'll have to hold elections and answer before his electorate for what he turned Ukraine into over the last 6 years, as well as answer for the hundreds of billions of state funds which he has stolen. And he'll have to answer to the West, first and foremost to the Americans, for the aid he received. Another force that's not interested in an end to hostilities is the party of war, or warmongers, in Europe. They have been implementing, since 2014 at least, an anti-Russian project in Ukraine, so as to ensure that military hostilities can end, so as to ensure that hostilities do not end without Russia's defeat, or without Russia at least being seriously bled dry. Because Ukraine is on the brink of full defeat, having lost millions of its citizens, European sponsors of the so-called private military company Ukraine are calling on Zelensky and his posse. In fact, they're ordering Zelensky and his posse to continue fighting to the last Ukrainian, which is compelling the Kyiv regime to seize the last remaining Ukrainian men in the streets and to send them to the senseless meat grinder. London, Brussels, Paris, and Berlin, without a doubt, were somewhat discouraged by the fact that Ukraine's main shareholder, so to speak, the US, the fact that the US left this senseless and disastrous game after a new, realistic administration came to power in Washington. However, these forces aren't losing hope. They want to bring Americans back into their ranks. And in order to achieve this, they're not above using any provocations, any lies about Russia and what we're doing, so as to force the American president to reconsider. They're grappling for his attention. That's why they're making all these statements about the Ukrainian conflict. I'm referring to Western politicians who are hoping to use blatant manipulations and obfuscation to prevent the American president from fixing the relationship with Russia. We know that before Trump came to power, that Trump is in fact getting constant information about Russian strikes on military-industrial complex sites in Ukraine, despite the fact, despite the fact that there are targeted strikes on civilian objects. At the same time, they are hushing up the fact that these strikes are being made on military objects and enterprises linked to the military-industrial complex in Ukraine, and that we are launching these strikes in response to the unprecedented escalation of strikes on civilians and civilian cities in Russia by the Kyiv regime. We gave statistics about this yesterday. In order to thwart efforts to establish peace, European states have, over the last few months, taken a whole host of steps so as to whip up tensions and escalate the situation. Thus, the new German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, recently said that restrictions will be lifted on long-range missiles being sent to Ukraine by the UK, France, Germany, and the US. He even specified that this happened a few months ago already. Experts directly linked his words with supplies of Taurus missiles to Kyiv, something the Kyiv regime has been begging for since we began the special military operation. Afterwards, the German leader did try to backtrack and started to say that Germany was in fact going to help Ukraine to independently produce long-range missiles. Without a doubt, these clumsy maneuvering didn't fool anybody. Furthermore, the assembly of Tauruses, as well as uncrewed British vessels, don't make them Ukrainian. Germany is going to be drawn further into a war with Russia through these actions, which will give us the right to consider all options so as to properly respond to this unfriendly step. If there's any common sense left in Berlin, if there are still people there who haven't forgotten history, they cannot but understand what these new aggressive actions in Germany against Russia will result in. Less than a month ago, we commemorated the 80th anniversary of the inglorious end of the previous such venture launched by Germany. In Europe, they should remember this full well. After all, they suffered a great deal from German militarism and other German ventures. On the whole, we cannot but note that Germany's actions are part of a campaign Europe has launched aimed at sabotaging the peace process, trying to provoke our country to respond in a way that they can then portray before the US administration as evidence of Moscow being not ready to partake in talks. Despite their own resources running low, EU states continue to try find ways of increasing military support to the neo-Nazi regime in Kyiv. This only serves to further foment tensions on the European continent. Thus, on the 26th of May, the European Council endorsed the establishment of a fund to the tune of 150 billion euros to buy ammunition and weapons. We know that this new instrument, the so-called Security Action for Europe instrument, will also be funded so-called urgent and large-scale investments in Ukrainian military production. Moreover, European states are shamelessly leading this proxy war with Russia, hoping that they will get off scot-free. They're providing Kyiv with satellite intelligence. They're preparing Ukrainian armed forces, they're training them at NATO military bases, and they're sending their military advisors to Ukrainian territory. Without a doubt, the UK is the country most involved in this. The scale of the British Special Services involvement is so large that it's very difficult to brush this under the carpet. At the end of March, British journalists published an investigation into this issue. This report stated that the British are cooperating with Ukrainian servicemen so as to prepare the operation to blow up the Crimean Bridge. It also says that as early as the middle of last year, British and US officers, or perhaps earlier, were controlling every aspect of this operation. They determined the coordinates of the targets, and they also calculated the trajectories of the missile's flight path. Colleagues, do you really think that we're not noticing any of this? That we don't have detailed information about the involvement of each and every one of your states in military activities against Russia? That there will be no consequences for these actions? And yet, you've been punishing not Russia, which is doing perfectly fine under sanctions. You are punishing yourselves. Compare the state of your countries now and 3 years ago. This shows how this senseless course is having an impact on the sponsors of the Kyiv regime. Until you stop considering what's happening as simply a zero-sum game, until you do that, the situation for Europe and its satellites will only go from bad to worse. Furthermore, it is high time to understand that there is no magical weapon that can change the course of the military campaign, which is going very poorly for Kyiv. Mr. Chairman, I harbor no doubts about the fact that today we will once again Here, carbon copy speeches from the Western sponsors of the Zelensky regime, allegations leveled at Russia, statements about Ukraine's right to self-defense using any means, and calls for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. This being portrayed as the only evidence of readiness to achieve peace and a ceasefire for minimum 30 days. Or for at least 30 days, a ceasefire. Yet if we take away all this rhetoric, which is being used to confuse the global south, we understand what is behind these initiatives. These initiatives are underpinned by a desire to once again confuse us, to compel us to take an unilateral act of good faith, which will then be used by the Ukrainians to gather their strength and also to pump Kyiv full of more weapons. This is not a path to peace. This is an attempt to pause so as to continue the confrontation. Well, don't count on it. You won't get another Minsk. In principle, we're prepared to consider the possibility of establishing a ceasefire, which would then, in future, pave the way for a lasting settlement to the root causes of the conflict. In order to achieve this, however, we need to see the other party taking steps as well. We've voiced our concerns on many occasions. During the ceasefire, we need, at the very least, for the Western states to stop supplying Kyiv with weapons, as well as for Ukraine to stop its mobilization. Yet all of your statements indicate that you cannot agree to such a scenario, whereas we cannot agree to a situation which would allow the Kyiv regime to lick their wounds and to stop the collapse of its Eastern Front. If we're seriously talking about peace, we need to discuss the parameters of peace, the conditions of peace, and after that actually discuss the ceasefire and agree to it. This is what the direct Russo-Ukrainian negotiations process in Istanbul is trying to achieve. This is the litmus test for a real, not simply in words, this is the real aspiration for peace. Especially given that the Russian Federation has already unilaterally respected a 30-day moratorium on strikes on energy infrastructure, as well as the Easter ceasefire, as well as the Victory Day ceasefire. The Kyiv regime simply ignored all of these opportunities to demonstrate its readiness to pursue peace. So what are you waiting for? What do you want from us? President, we've said and want to repeat that the objective of our special military operation can be achieved through peaceful or military means. Our armed forces stand ready to continue stepping up their military activities insofar as is necessary. Look at any military reports, even those biased against Russia. They clearly show that Russian forces are successfully making headway across practically the entire front line. Our Ministry of Defense is publishing information on a daily basis about us freeing various settlements and destroying foreign equipment. Despite the fact we've always underscored that we are committed to a political and diplomatic settlement of the crisis. What's of principal importance for us is for the root causes of the conflict to be addressed once and for all. In 2014, owing to an anti-constitutional coup d'etat supported and sponsored by the US and the EU, a new regime came to power in Ukraine, and it tried to stamp out all that is Russian. Over all these years, it has violated the rights of people living in the east and the south of Ukraine and in other regions as well. We cannot and will not sit idly by and look on as millions of Russian-speaking people continue to live under a regime where it's pursuing a policy which flagrantly violates their main rights and freedoms. If the authorities in Kyiv, neo-Nazi authorities, think that they can achieve an end to the military hostilities and at the same time maintain the system of repression and discrimination vis-à-vis a significant portion of its own population in Ukraine, well then they're deeply mistaken. Maintaining the status quo means that knowingly ignoring norms of international law and the UN Charter. Article 1 of the Charter clearly states that we must respect human rights irrespective of their language, race, sex, or religion. Today, in Ukraine, we see the exact opposite. In practice, the Russian-speaking population is being persecuted. The canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church is seeing restrictions placed on its activities, and there are other flagrant violations of the rights of national minorities. Thus, we call on our European colleagues who have been so actively defending democratic values to demand for Kyiv to abolish discriminatory laws which are directly at odds with international law. This would be an opportunity to really put your position to the test. For now, we've heard all sorts of pronouncements about human rights, but we haven't seen a single instance of real steps being taken to protect the rights of millions of people. Their rights are being systematically violated in Ukraine as we speak. The political expediency is making our Western colleagues deaf and dumb when it comes to the rights of the Russian-speaking population in Ukraine, the Russian language, canonical orthodoxy, the glorification of Hitler's accomplices, and the dissemination of neo-Nazism in Ukraine. If you really do want lasting and sustainable peace in Ukraine, the current situation cannot continue. President, the time has come for everyone to choose. We did this back in 2022. And we won't leave Russian people to their own devices. If we need, we will continue fighting for as long as necessary, if that's necessary. No threats to our borders, no anti-Russian, neo-Nazi education in neighboring countries. We won't allow for any of that to happen. Now the ball is in the court of those who are behind the anti-Russian project in Ukraine. Did they understand the mistakes they made, how senseless it is to try and vanquish and isolate Russia? If you truly are Russophobes, then, well, we probably don't have anything to discuss with you. However, if you are ready to discuss potential options for us to coexist or perhaps even to cooperate, then we can talk. We've never rejected dialogue, nor do we reject dialogue now. The choice is yours. I thank you.
Subscribe to One India and never miss an update.